All right, folks, this is part 2 of our summer outlook. We talked about the temperature outlook, expecting warmer than average temperatures for much of the central, eastern U.S., southwest. The only spot that could be a little bit cooler than average is across the northwestern part of the U.S. Now, we are expecting it to be drier than average across the east, but lots of rain and storms across the Midwest. Less rain as you get through the plains and agricultural belt. Wet in eastern Texas, a wet monsoon season and less than average rain across parts of the Cascades. Now, what's the impact of the monsoon season? Well, let's check it out, folks, because typically when you get down to New Mexico and Arizona, about 60 to 70% of the rain here falls June, July, August through September as we get a return flow and moisture coming into the southwest. So they do rely heavily on rainfall during the late summer and the early part of the fall season. That being said, let's see the impact of El Nino and La Nina on the rainfall across the southwest. Lots of dots on here, but what this shows is when you have a La Nina pattern, you're more likely to have rainfall exceed average. Last year was one of the driest years in Phoenix in the southwest because we were in an El Nino pattern. It was pretty dry. El Nino typically produces less than average rain. So we are expecting the opposite this coming summer into the early part of the fall season. So places like Phoenix will probably have lots of downpours, more rain than average across the southwest. Now let's come back home and talk about June. Okay, so this is for southern West Virginia, and this is the number of cooling degree days compared to average for the analog years that I chose to represent this summer season. So every time you see a dip, that means you are going to have a break from your air conditioner cost, and every spike above this white line means there's more strain on your air conditioner to run. So looks like we start out June a little bit on the cooler side, which is nice, but we have a pretty big spike once we get into the middle of June, a little bit of a dip, and then we do transition to a warmer spell once we get into the later part of June. So we could have a couple of cold fronts come through very early in the season to give us a break from the heat and the humidity and the strain on your air conditioner. But once we get into the later part of June, we start to really crank things up. How does July look? Well, these are the July analog years, and really no big reprieve from any major cold fronts, which is typically what we would expect, also in a La Nina. So early part of July and right around the 12th, there's a little dip there above the average line, but check it out, folks, especially once we get into the 20th to 25th of July, pretty warm, pretty humid across the region, and your air conditioner will be running nonstop. What does the month of August look like? Well, the first part of August, a big strain on the electric bill, regardless of what you keep your temperature at. Most of you probably keep it at about 72 to 75 degrees. We get a nice little drop here in the analog year, so a little bit of a cooler spell once we get into about August 22nd, 23rd, and then another big strain on the air conditioner bill once we get into the end of August. Now, how does rainfall distribution through the summer impact yields on fruit production? We talked to a horticultural specialist for the answer.
If you have most of your fruit most of your rain in June, July, August, that might lead to more rots, more disease pressure.
Okay.
You might have bitter rot, you might have black rot, you might have even white rot. You might have a lot of scab. You might have a lot of some of the summer diseases like fly speck and sooty blotch. So
okay.
That's in apples. In peaches, you're going to have a lot of rust, a lot of rots. Brown rot. That's going to be one of the major problems, and you might not be able to even have a harvestable crop because of all these things.
Okay.
So that's the problem with that. So
okay.
In essence, even though it's not good, but of these extremes, in essence, I would rather have more rain up front earlier in the season than a little bit later on.
Okay.
If your fruit survives those rot and disease pressure, it might not have enough cells, that were determined usually within the 3 weeks post full bloom or fruit set. Within these 3 weeks after the fruit set, cell division occurs and predetermines the size of your fruit. The more cells you have, the larger the fruit.
Okay. Gotcha.
So, later on, what happens, you have just that X number of cells, no more, after that period. And so, if you have too much water, the fruit cannot, or that number of cells that you have is not capable of absorbing all that water, so it's going to start splitting.
Okay. Okay. And when you define early in the season, you're talking May and June, correct?
Yeah, I would rather have it in May and June in order to have fruit normally develop. It might be a little bit smaller, but at least it's not going to split.
To split, okay.
But, yeah. But
Okay.
if you have, too much water, when the fruit is sizing up and it starts to change the color and stuff, so you're talking basically, July, August, late June, July, August. September. In September, we start with the harvest already.
Right.
Well, this year it started in July. I have some very early cultivars, so I started, July, late July harvest. But what I'm saying, if you have too much water in that period, then you're going to have a lot of disease pressure, and you're going to have fruit splitting, which is again going to facilitate disease development.
So the overall theme, folks, is that if we get a large volume of water June, July, and August, that's going to cause disease and basically cause problems with the fruit production come September. So it's okay to have dry periods, especially in West Virginia where we have the clay soil. So that means the water is able to hold itself through the dry periods and the warm periods that we have. Here's the rainfall distribution during the analog summers that I chose. And notice we have that spike in June, which makes sense because we have occasional cold fronts coming through to bring some temperature relief. But then look at that. Once we get to the middle of July onwards, there's a pretty good trend for drier weather to develop. So the overall theme is the first part of the summer season will feature a bit of rain, but we should be in a pretty good spot for fruit farmers this particular summer. Now there's some microclimates out there like downwind of the mountains in the Greenbrier Valley that stays a little bit drier than average, so there could be some problems in those particular spots. But overall, we have the great distribution with the rain early in the season, and it does dry out a bit, so we shouldn't have any prolonged periods of occasional showers and storms that would contribute to the diseases that she was mentioning. What about severe weather across the region? We've had our fair share in April. In two of the analog years that I looked at, just specifically for Fayette County, this is in 2010. So these are the severe thunderstorm warnings issued for Fayette County. June was pretty quiet. July we had a couple. In early August we had a couple in the early part of the month. And then checking out 2016 calendar of severe thunderstorm warnings, and really it wasn't too much of an active period once we flip here to 2016 in terms of severe weather across the region. A couple in June 21st, but there were 7 warnings on June 23rd, and then once we look into July, there were a few in August. But the overall theme is, we will have our share of severe weather across the region, but we're not expecting the uptick that we saw early part of the spring season. So the overall theme is, folks, yes, it'll cost you more to keep your house a little bit cooler this coming summer. And rainfall, while we're not expected to get into a drought, will trend very close to that drier period in the Greenbrier Valley, but a bit wet along the Route 19 corridor. But at least with the distribution of the rain, we get a chance along Route 19 to dry out a bit in the middle part of July, heading towards the first part of August. So that is your 2024 summer outlook. And of course, we will continue to follow the trends going forward through those warm months and provide the latest with every newscast. Chief Meteorologist Chad Merrill for Newswatch.